Jackson Taylor, an unassuming yet diligent homeowner in the seemingly idyllic Willow Creek Gardens, had always found solace in the routine of tending to his lush, carefully shaped hedges that flanked his property and provided the privacy he cherished. He had spent 6 years patiently trimming and measuring them every Saturday morning, ensuring they never exceeded the HOA's stipulated 7-foot limit, all the while believing he was fulfilling his obligations as a responsible resident. One fateful afternoon, however, he returned from work to a scene of utter devastation, for the hedges he had so lovingly cultivated were butchered down to a meager 3 feet, their severed limbs scattered across the once pristine lawn. Standing aghast, Jackson scarcely had time to process the damage when he noticed a yellow slip taped to his front door, a $750 citation from the Willow Creek Gardens HOA, accusing him of violating vegetation height restrictions. Shaking with disbelief, he realized something was amiss. As his weekly measuring ritual confirmed, he had always remained within guidelines, and there had been no prior warning or complaint. Anger and confusion spurred him to seek answers. After all, it wasn't just about the money, but the principle that someone had trespassed onto his property and destroyed a privacy barrier he had nurtured for years. As he stared at the stumps where his hedges once stood proud, his cheeks flushed with indignation, and he replayed every instance of diligent upkeep in his mind, wondering how in the world his shrubs could have been declared a hazard. What made the matter even more surreal was the mocking smirk of his neighbor, Diane Reynolds, across the street, who had previously voiced her annoyance at how Jackson's hedges obstructed her view of the neighborhood. That smirk suggested she knew more than she was letting on, and it enraged him to think that the HOA might have sanctioned this correction based on a neighbor's personal grudge rather than a legitimate code violation. Determined to confront the organization that had imposed this outrageous fine, Jackson dialed the HOA's office, only to meet the unyielding voice of Margaret, who seemed to dismiss his concerns with bureaucratic detachment. Margaret's insistence that the board had received multiple complaints and had voted on corrective action the previous week infuriated Jackson, since he was never notified of the vote, nor was any official inspection conducted to confirm actual noncompliance. It was at that moment he realized the HOA's rules, which he had painstakingly adhered to, might in fact be arbitrarily enforced, benefiting those with connections and punishing those who dared to ask questions or stand in the way of certain agendas. Still reeling from Margaret's stonewalling, Jackson tried to grasp how such a systematic injustice could occur in a neighborhood that prided itself on order, uniformity, and fairness, at least on the surface. He remembered countless HOA meetings, many of which were sparsely attended by indifferent residents who assumed everything was running smoothly. It now dawned on him that this complacency might have allowed a select group to exercise outsized power. His frustration grew when he spotted Karen Wilson, the imperious board president, casually driving by in her gleaming black SUV. She paused just long enough to roll down the window and deliver a condescending remark about how the improved landscaping better suited the community's aesthetic. Karen's dismissive attitude and the way she wielded her authority like a sledgehammer left Jackson seething, particularly when she implied that he had been intentionally flouting the regulations. Suspecting foul play, Jackson revisited every page of the HOA bylaws he had in his files, determined to confirm exactly where the rules began and ended regarding hedge height. Upon confirming that his hedges were indeed within the 7-foot threshold, his sense of righteousness burned all the brighter. Fueling his determination was the knowledge that some of his neighbors had similarly bizarre experiences of unannounced infractions, slapped with staggering fines for seemingly innocuous issues like mailbox color or minor fence repairs. As the evening wore on, Jackson began cataloging his photographic evidence. The jagged stumps, the date-stamped photos from previous weeks showing the hedge height, and the newly minted citation, readying himself for a formal challenge. Amid his furious preparations, an unexpected email arrived in his inbox, carrying the formal confirmation of his newly awarded role, the Willow Creek Gardens HOA's financial auditor position. At first, Jackson felt a jolt of confusion. How could the same organization that just penalized him with a spurious fine now be offering him access to their inner workings? Then a sudden clarity seized him, a realization that the board likely hadn't connected the dots, that the homeowner they just targeted was the very same professional they had contracted to review their financial records. This inadvertent slip by the board would place Jackson in the perfect position to investigate the HOA from within, not just for his own sake, but on behalf of every resident who had ever felt persecuted by mysterious fines and authoritarian rulings. In a haze of excitement and righteous indignation, he recognized the priceless leverage he now held, possessing both a personal stake in discovering the truth and an official mandate that granted him legal access to the board's financial documents. That night, while the torn remnants of his hedges lay in heaps outside, Jackson resolved not to waste this opportunity to expose any wrongdoing that had gone unchecked under Karen's iron-fisted leadership. Already, memories of prior HOA controversies surfaced in his mind. Neighbors whispering about unfair fees, manipulative tactics at monthly meetings, and rumored nepotism in awarding landscaping contracts. Jackson suspected that these unsubstantiated rumors might be the tip of a much larger iceberg, one that he could finally unearth with his auditor credentials. Before dawn broke, he meticulously wrote down a plan to collate every invoice, contract, and fine the HOA had administered in recent years, cross-referencing them for patterns of nepotism, inflated costs, or selective enforcement. The next day, he lingered near his window, watching as a few neighbors stopped to gawk at the ravaged hedges. Though he saw shock and sympathy in their eyes, he also sensed a collective fear of speaking out against the powerful board. Turning away from the bleak view, he started making calls to city offices, verifying property boundaries and easements, wanting to confirm that no legitimate reason existed for forcibly reducing the hedge height on his private property. By the time he left the house, armed with measuring tapes, photos, and a growing file of damning information, Jackson's resolve had solidified. He would not rest until the board answered for this unwarranted destruction. His first call of the day was to the county records office, where he reviewed every official blueprint he could access, uncovering absolutely no justification for any outside entity to intrude on his land. His second visit was to the homes of other residents who had shared complaints in the past, collecting statements that mirrored his own experiences of intimidation and arbitrary fines. That evening, he stayed up late, ordering files into digital folders, labeling them by violation type and cross-linking them with relevant HOA regulations. He found email chains discussing urgent vegetation compliance, but most telling of all was a mention of Elite Green Solutions, a landscaping company that inexplicably charged double or triple the standard market rate. While rummaging through these digital traces, Jackson discovered a further twist. The owner of Elite Green Solutions bore the same surname as Karen Wilson, strengthening his suspicions of nepotistic business dealings. The revelation that the same company responsible for trimming neighborhood greenery at inflated prices might be directly tied to the board president was a pivotal clue, pointing to the potential for widespread corruption. This chain of evidence ignited his conscience, letting him see that his unfortunate hedge butchering might actually pave the way to unveiling how the HOA had been systematically fleecing unsuspecting neighbors for years. Fueling him even more was the realization that many residents faced similarly arbitrary disruptions, from forced fence removal to questionable painting guidelines, all accompanied by hefty fines and a less-than-transparent appeals process. Clutching a cup of coffee at midnight, Jackson reread the confirmation email for his auditor's role, a surge of anticipation making him all too aware that he was on the precipice of something huge, an internal investigation that could shake the entire foundation of Willow Creek Gardens. Despite knowing the next few weeks would be fraught with confrontation, he welcomed the challenge, for he believed in accountability and justice, the very principles the HOA was supposed to uphold. As he set his alarm to meet an early morning appointment with an ally on the board, Thomas Garcia, reputedly the only member who occasionally stood up to Karen, Jackson couldn't help but feel a faint optimism that, through his diligence, change was finally coming. His determination that no more Hedges, homes, or homeowners would be wronged under Karen's regime made him push past the lingering anger and channel it into strategic preparation. If the board thought Jackson would quietly accept a $750 fine and move on, they had grossly underestimated the power of a patient, detail-oriented individual who understood both the HOA bylaws and the intricacies of financial oversight. Yes, he had to endure the sight of his once beautiful hedges decimated, but those stumps in his yard now stood as a monument to the beginning of a much larger fight for transparency and fairness. Each time he looked at the debris, he reminded himself that if no one stood up to corrupt power, entire neighborhoods could be held hostage by leaders who only pretended to serve the collective good. As day turned to night, Jackson continued to compile his digital audit log, feeling both the weight of his own personal grievance and the moral imperative to defend his community. He envisioned the final confrontation with Karen and her board cohorts, a scenario where documented proof of their rampant abuses would force them to face consequences long overdue. Shadows of doubt sometimes flickered through his mind. What if the board turned the community against him? Or if they manipulated the system to silence him before he could present his findings? Yet for every anxious thought, he found renewed courage, propelled by the knowledge that truth, once uncovered, could not be hidden again. Even in the darkest corners of Willow Creek Gardens politics, Jackson believed that transparency would triumph, and so he vowed to see this mission through to the end, no matter how fierce Karen's opposition might become. Jackson's first day as the official financial auditor of Willow Creek Gardens began under a cloud of tension. As he arrived at the HOA's administrative office clutching a carefully organized binder of references, bylaws, and past meeting minutes, determined to maintain a professional facade despite the ongoing personal conflict over his hedges. Margaret, the stern receptionist he had spoken to on the phone, seemed visibly unsettled when he flashed his newly issued badge, and her nervous attempts at small talk did little to mask her suspicion that Jackson's presence spelled trouble for the tight circle of HOA board members. After signing the necessary paperwork, Jackson was ushered into a modest cubicle space near the back of the office, where he wasted no time in booting up the antiquated computer system to access financial records he was now authorized to review. He discovered a labyrinth of encrypted files, poorly scanned invoices, and disorganized spreadsheets, indicating either severe administrative incompetence or a deliberate strategy to obscure questionable transactions. Undeterred by the messy digital landscape, Jackson methodically created folders for each budget category: landscaping, community events, reserves, repairs, and miscellaneous, knowing that a structured approach would be essential in tracing any illicit financial flows. With an eye trained by years of accounting experience, he immediately spotted inconsistencies in the landscaping budget, where Elite Green Solutions invoices appeared in suspiciously frequent intervals, often for tasks labeled as urgent or emergency, without corroborating documentation. His heart pounded when he noticed that each of those so-called emergency invoices carried a bill at least double the rates he had seen for legitimate landscaping elsewhere, reinforcing his earlier suspicion that Karen's family ties to Elite Green Solutions were more than just a coincidence. Eager to confirm his hunches, Jackson cross-referenced those invoices with board meeting notes, only to find that the official record seldom mentioned awarding contracts, indicating that the deals might have bypassed standard approval processes and were instead made behind closed doors. An unsettling pattern emerged. Whenever a resident complained about a minor issue or fell out of favor with Karen or her allies, it seemed that Elite Green Solutions would be contracted soon after to remedy an invented problem, often charging the HOA and the homeowner simultaneously. Armed with new leads, Jackson decided to consult the rosters of board members over the past 5 years, revealing that nearly every person with a close relationship to Karen enjoyed a history of waived fines, flexible interpretations of the rules, or unpublicized reimbursements for questionable expenses. It was during a break room coffee refill that Thomas Garcia, the youngest board member and reputed voice of reason, discreetly approached Jackson to introduce himself, muttering that he appreciated Jackson's thoroughness and wanted to see the truth come to light. Thomas explained how he had tried to question Karen's allocation of funds in the past, but found himself consistently sidelined or outvoted, with the minutes of those meetings scrubbed clean of his objections, leaving him powerless to enact real change alone. Intrigued by Thomas's openness, Jackson invited him to a private conversation after work, suggesting they compare notes and strategize a way to present the evidence in a manner that the board and the wider community could not simply ignore or dismiss. Throughout the rest of the day, Jackson continued to dive deeper into the budgets, discovering a disturbing funneling of money labeled as beautification projects, all earmarked for vaguely defined landscaping or holiday lighting endeavors, managed exclusively by Elite Green Solutions. Cross-checking homeowner complaint logs with these expenses, he found a direct correlation between homeowners who had voiced dissatisfaction and sudden spikes in charges purportedly spent on rectifying violations at their properties. Though not a lawyer, Jackson suspected these patterns of selective enforcement and nepotistic contract awards could potentially rise to the level of criminal fraud, should the numbers prove as damning as they appeared on paper. As he combed through older financial statements, he came across large payouts tagged under special assessments that were never clearly explained in the board meeting notes, in some cases directly contradicting homeowner recollections of why their fees had been raised. Tensions at the office became palpable each time Karen strutted down the hallway, flanked by a small cadre of like-minded members who glared at Jackson with icy disdain, as though his mere presence threatened to unravel years of carefully orchestrated deals. Meanwhile, Margaret seemed torn between her loyalty to Karen and her discomfort in the face of Jackson's legitimate position, often delivering stacks of incomplete paperwork with apologetic shrugs that hinted she was simply following orders. Late in the afternoon, Jackson found a key document tucked in a mislabeled folder. A canceled check from the HOA made out to Karen Wilson herself, described as a reimbursement for special community outreach, lacking any receipts or event details to justify the sizable sum. Realizing that he was in possession of what might be a smoking gun, Jackson scanned and saved the file to a secure external drive, fully aware that he needed to create backups to protect his findings from any potential sabotage or accidental deletions. By the time he gathered his belongings to leave for the day, Jackson's head buzzed with the knowledge that he had stumbled onto something bigger than mere favoritism or mild corruption. There seemed to be a systematic plan to milk the HOA coffers for personal gain. Driving home, he couldn't help but notice fresh damage to his already mangled hedges, as if someone had vandalized them further out of spite. A harsh reminder that his stand against the status quo could provoke retaliation beyond financial intimidation. Spurred by both anger and moral conviction, Jackson swung into action, stopping by the county clerk's office to gather more evidence on Elite Green Solutions and cross-check the company's licensing details, discovering that its address led to a modest P.O. box rather than a real business location. Additionally, he found that its file date coincided suspiciously with the period just after Karen first assumed the board presidency, further supporting the theory that this enterprise existed primarily as a vehicle for siphoning HOA funds. On a hunch, Jackson phoned the state licensing board to confirm the status of Elite Green Solutions and was informed that it had received multiple complaints for overcharging customers, poor workmanship, and operating beyond its licensed scope of services. Even armed with this new information, Jackson recognized the need for a carefully orchestrated approach to unveiling the entire scheme, since a careless leak or accusation might give Karen time to destroy evidence or rally her allies to cover their tracks. He convened that evening with Thomas Garcia at a local cafe, sharing printouts of spreadsheets, suspicious invoices, and the questionable reimbursements, prompting Thomas to shake his head in dismay, admitting he had never guessed the corruption ran so deep. Thomas confided that Karen had gained influence not just by her boisterous personality, but through a network of favors, reciprocated votes on neighborhood issues, and subtle intimidation that kept dissenters quiet. Jackson assured him that their best move was to collect airtight documentation that would survive legal scrutiny, even if Karen attempted to discredit them in front of the residents or in a court of law. At Thomas's suggestion, they devised a plan to enlist the help of a small group of trustworthy neighbors, especially those who possessed administrative or legal know-how, so they could discreetly build a coalition ready to confront Karen when the time was right. In hushed tones, they also discussed the possibility of reaching out to local media outlets, theorizing that public exposure could be a powerful weapon against Karen's manipulations, though they agreed to wait for concrete evidence before issuing any statements. Back in his car, Jackson took a moment to reflect on how quickly his life had flipped from quietly tending his yard to leading a personal crusade against a corrupt network, questioning whether he could handle the heat of a battle against such a well-established authority figure. As if answering his own doubts, he envisioned his destroyed hedges and recalled the helpless fury he felt upon seeing them. That memory steeled his resolve to fight not just for himself, but for every resident too fearful or too overwhelmed to fight back. Within hours, he updated his personal audit logs, creating a timeline that would illustrate how Karen's rise to power aligned neatly with the founding of Elite Green Solutions and the subsequent skyrocketing of landscaping costs on the HOA's books. He flagged each suspicious transaction, annotated each invoice with side notes of possible connections to board members, and accumulated a growing list of residents who had voiced complaints or paid inexplicable fines over the years. By the time he finally closed his laptop, night had enveloped Willow Creek Gardens, but Jackson felt a stirring sense of hope, convinced that the truth, though buried under a mountain of deceit, was now within his reach. He recognized the risks of confronting entrenched corruption, possible legal entanglements, social ostracism, or even personal threats, but he also felt buoyed by a quiet certainty that genuine justice and transparency could rally the neighborhood to his cause. As he drifted to sleep, faint images of meticulously typed financial summaries, scanned canceled checks, and the determined faces of allies filled his mind, reminding him that the final showdown with Karen was nearing, and that he could not afford to falter now, when everything was at stake. Determined and newly supported by unexpected allies, Jackson resolved to continue amassing evidence the very next day. Readying himself for the day, he would pull back the curtain on all the backroom dealings that had hijacked Willow Creek Gardens. Little did he know, a critical tipping point was looming on the horizon, where Karen's fear of exposure would drive her to desperate measures, prompting her to escalate the conflict in a way that would shake the entire community out of its complacency. True to their pact, Jackson and Thomas began their clandestine outreach in earnest, quietly visiting longtime homeowners who had either suffered at the hands of the HOA or expressed private discontent with Karen's reign, hoping to transform scattered grievances into a united front. As they knocked on doors under the guise of friendly neighborhood check-ins, they discovered a plethora of pent-up frustration. Residents fined for innocuous garden ornaments, threatened with legal action over harmless yard decorations, and subjected to repeated intimidation. One elderly couple tearfully recounted how they had paid nearly $1,000 to Elite Green Solutions for a supposed hazard tree removal on the HOA's orders, even though an arborist later confirmed that the tree was healthy and posed no risk. Another homeowner, who asked to remain anonymous for fear of retaliation, showed Jackson a stack of baffling violation letters spanning several years, each citing trivial issues like minor mailbox rust or barely visible cracks in the driveway. Thomas documented every story they heard, while Jackson, ever the meticulous accountant, cross-referenced these anecdotes with the financial records he had uncovered, finding each incident matched suspicious entries for emergency landscaping or code enforcement fees. A shared realization took root among them all. Karen and her inner circle systematically exploited the bylaws to crush dissent, collect fines, and funnel money to Elite Green Solutions without meaningful oversight. Energized by the growing trove of first-hand accounts, Jackson crafted a plan to host a covert gathering at the community park, inviting only those he and Thomas trusted to remain level-headed and discreet about the evidence they planned to share. The idea was to build momentum before the upcoming board meeting, ensuring that when the time came, they would have enough collective voices demanding accountability to corner Karen and her allies. However, word of their quiet activism began to leak through the neighborhood grapevine, prompting suspicious glances from certain board loyalists who seemed intent on following Jackson's every move. On the eve of the park meeting, Jackson awoke to a loud clatter outside. To his horror, he found that someone had vandalized his car, spray-painting the words "Mind Your Business" across the driver's side door in glaring red letters. Though shaken by this blatant intimidation tactic, Jackson refused to be deterred, choosing instead to call the local police to file a report and document the latest attempt to silence him. Thomas, who had faced less direct harassment so far, confessed that he feared escalation, worrying that if Karen's faction felt cornered, they might employ even more drastic measures to protect themselves and their lucrative schemes. Nevertheless, the pair resolved to move forward with the planned gathering, hoping that transparency and group resolve would fortify everyone against individual acts of bullying or sabotage. Late that afternoon, in a secluded corner of Willow Creek Gardens, Central Park, well away from prying eyes, they convened with a dozen neighbors who had either been victims or concerned observers of the HOA's machinations. Mrs. Jenkins, a retired librarian known for her quiet demeanor, surprised everyone by producing meticulously kept records of her own, including copies of every violation letter and fine notice she had paid over the last decade, which she believed were baseless. Another neighbor, Mr. Chan, displayed a spreadsheet he had created showing fluctuations in monthly dues that never matched the so-called improvement projects the HOA claimed to undertake, citing invoices from Elite Green Solutions in particular. As Jackson and Thomas shared their compiled evidence, financial statements, questionable payouts to Karen, and suspicious connections to Elite Green Solutions, a collective gasp arose, followed by a rapid exchange of stories that affirmed the group's shared experiences. In that moment, a sense of unity surfaced, as though a floodgate had opened and everyone was finally free to speak truthfully about a tyranny that most had been too frightened to name outright. Determined to channel their outrage into constructive action, Jackson suggested forming an independent homeowners coalition, a grassroots effort to demand transparency and accountability from the board at the next public meeting. While some remained hesitant, citing fear of reprisals, Thomas assured them that the bylaws required the board to allow residents to speak and present evidence at official gatherings, regardless of Karen's attempts to stifle dissent. Emboldened, the group decided to gather an even larger audience, secretly circulating flyers titled, "Take Back Willow Creek Gardens," to be slipped under doors and posted discreetly on community bulletin boards under cover of darkness. Thanks to a few tech-savvy residents, they also set up an anonymous online forum where neighbors could submit their stories of HOA harassment, complete with scanned copies of violation notices and suspicious invoices. Within days, the forum swelled with testimonies from people who had been fined for everything from installing low-flow garden hoses to displaying a welcome mat that wasn't on the approved color list, each accompanied by sky-high emergency service fees from Elite Green Solutions. In parallel, Jackson expanded his own internal audit to correlate each new testimonial with the official financial records, piecing together an ever-lengthening list of unapproved expenditures and inflated reimbursements. Believing it was time to amplify the issue further, Thomas used a burner email account to tip off a local journalist about potential corruption within Willow Creek Gardens, careful not to reveal anyone's identity just yet. Sure enough, a curious reporter from the regional newspaper began sniffing around, calling residents to verify their stories and requesting official board statements on the suspicious landscaping expenses. When confronted with these inquiries, Karen reportedly dismissed them as fabrications by a few disgruntled homeowners. But her hasty reaction did little to quell the journalists' interest. As whispers of a brewing scandal circulated, the board called an emergency meeting to address what they called false allegations, a move Jackson interpreted as Karen trying to regain control of the narrative before it spiraled out of her reach. Concurrently, Thomas received an anonymous tip that Karen planned to unveil a new set of punitive rules at this emergency meeting, possibly raising additional fees for residents who spread slanderous statements about the HOA's leadership. Alarmed at this brazen strategy, Jackson and Thomas scrambled to rally their coalition for a robust showing at the meeting, hoping to prevent Karen from railroading the community into silence through intimidation tactics disguised as policy amendments. On the night of the emergency meeting, residents packed into the small community center, their murmured conversations a blend of fear, anger, and anticipation, as they awaited the board's arrival. Standing at the front, Jackson recognized many faces from the park gathering, each determined to speak out despite the potential backlash, while others, who had previously avoided all HOA meetings, appeared eager to hear the long-hidden truth. When Karen swept into the room, flanked by several of her staunchest allies, the tension was palpable. The hum of conversation died down instantly as she assumed her place at the central table with a steely glare directed at Jackson and Thomas. In her opening address, Karen claimed the community was under attack from malicious rumors, insisting all finances were properly managed and that any landscaping actions taken were for the greater good of Willow Creek Gardens. Her tone laced with contempt, she then proposed a new bylaw granting the board unilateral authority to enforce silence on defamatory claims, effectively muzzling any homeowners who dared to question her regime. Outraged, Mrs. Jenkins stood up, cane in hand, and declared that Karen's so-called defamation clause was an insult to every honest neighbor who had been unjustly fined or harassed, drawing applause from a surprising majority of attendees. Sensing the crowd's support, Jackson seized the moment and requested the floor to present official financial records he had uncovered that very week, exposing glaring contradictions in the board's expenditure reports. Thomas seconded the request, citing the exact bylaw provision that required Karen to permit residents to speak, thereby preventing her from shutting Jackson down under the glare of dozens of watchful eyes and a roving newspaper reporter. In that pivotal moment, as Jackson powered on the overhead projector and prepared to lay bare the evidence, the once docile neighborhood revealed its latent strength, a collective refusal to allow Karen's unscrupulous rule to continue unchecked. No one in the room could predict precisely how the showdown would end, but the days of silent compliance were clearly over, replaced by an irrepressible demand for honesty and the promise of a reclaimed community. Although Karen's attempt to quash opposition with her so-called defamation clause had been met with widespread indignation, She still held the official gavel and the power to steer the conversation, at least for the moment, prompting Jackson to deliver his findings with unwavering precision. Standing at the projector, Jackson began his presentation by highlighting how the HOA budget ballooned inexplicably in the landscaping category over 3 consecutive years, correlating each surge with the formation and expansion of elite green solutions. He showed a detailed timeline, indicating that the business was registered just weeks before Karen's election as board president, and how its skyrocketing profits suspiciously aligned with her growing influence within Willow Creek Gardens. Pausing dramatically, he revealed photographs of repeated emergency landscaping efforts that, based on documentation from professional arborists and independent contractors, were either blatantly unnecessary or grossly overcharged. The crowd gasped when Jackson introduced canceled checks written directly to Karen Wilson from the HOA's account, labeled vaguely as community outreach reimbursements, yet never disclosed or detailed in the board's official financial records. Visibly shaken, Karen attempted to interrupt, declaring that such reimbursements were standard for incidental community expenses, though she offered no explanation as to why she had failed to follow standard documentation procedures. Thomas stepped forward to reinforce Jackson's claims, reminding everyone that he had been present at several board meetings where discussions of these supposed projects were either glossed over or entirely missing from the minutes, despite large sums being allocated. Meanwhile, the murmurs from the back of the room intensified, as more residents recognized their own stories reflected in Jackson's data. Fines doubled, triple charged, or used as a pretext to funnel funds into elite green solutions pockets. Diane, who had earlier worn a smug expression whenever Jackson was in the room, now avoided eye contact, her face betraying a mix of guilt and fear as the evidence mounted. Seizing the opening, Mrs. Jenkins took the microphone next, brandishing her meticulously organized folder of violation notices dating back nearly a decade, each paired with an invoice from Elite Green Solutions for rectifying so-called code breaches. She pointed out that the alleged issues, ranging from a few extra inches on her lawn hedges to minuscule paint chips on her shutters, were never recorded as official violations on the HOA website, suggesting a shadow system of enforcements unlogged by the board. The hush in the room deepened as more neighbors stood up in turn, recounting how Karen or her close associates had issued steep fines or threatened them with liens, only to cancel or reduce these penalties once they paid Elite Green Solutions directly. Flustered, Karen demanded order, her voice betraying anger as she insisted these accounts were riddled with exaggerations and that the HOA acted only in the community's best interest, citing safety and aesthetic standards. Yet the furious glare of the gathered residents, many of whom had come armed with their own evidence, made it clear that they were not buying her attempts at damage control. To further intensify the stakes, a journalist who had quietly arrived mid-meeting stood with a recording device in hand, requesting an official statement from the board about the conflicting financial documents now displayed for all to see. Karen's eyes flickered with alarm, and she tried to hastily adjourn the session, claiming that the matter was too complex to handle in a single evening and needed expert assessment. Thomas quickly invoked a procedural bylaw that prevented adjournment without a majority vote, prompting the assembled homeowners to erupt in protest when Karen attempted to ignore his motion and stride toward the exit. In a moment of sheer audacity, Karen grabbed the gavel and banged it repeatedly, declaring that the meeting was over, but the outraged calls of "point of order" from multiple residents drowned her out. Unsure how to maintain her grip on the proceedings, Karen glared at Jackson, pointing a finger at him as though he were solely responsible for stirring up chaos, while her longtime ally Robert whispered furiously in her ear. At that juncture, Diane unexpectedly stood up, trembling as she clutched some papers and began to speak, her voice quavering with reluctant confession. She admitted to filing multiple complaints at Karen's behest, specifically to trigger fees that would be funneled into Elite Green Solutions. She tearfully apologized to neighbors like Jackson and Mrs. Jenkins, confessing that Karen had convinced her these tactics were necessary to keep the neighborhood up to standard. But now she realized how manipulative and unjust it all had been. Stunned silence reigned as Diane passed the papers to Jackson, who glanced at them and confirmed they were email correspondences demonstrating Karen's direct instructions to fabricate or exaggerate complaints against certain properties. Karen's facade of composure cracked further, and she launched into a tirade about personal vendettas and misinformation, claiming Diane was disgruntled over a separate matter and thus lying to sabotage the HOA leadership. Not missing a beat, Thomas advised the journalist to note that this was now a case of one board member contradicting another under oath, a serious situation that could warrant an external investigation. At the mention of an external probe, a visible tension rippled through Karen's loyalists, who seemed all too aware that official scrutiny could unearth far more than inflated landscaping charges. Despite Karen's attempts to regain control, residents demanded a vote of no confidence, citing the bylaw allowing them to propose the immediate removal of a board president who had been deemed negligent or corrupt in financial oversight. As Thomas read the relevant bylaw language, Karen tried once more to storm out, claiming she refused to participate in a witch hunt. But the crowd blocked her path, chanting for transparency and justice. Seeing the dramatic escalation, Robert stepped forward to defend Karen, shouting that the community was spiraling into mob rule and that these allegations had yet to be proven in a court of law. Jackson calmly pointed out that the meeting itself was designed to address these issues openly and fairly, and that Karen's own refusal to address the mounting evidence only raised further suspicion. To pacify the uproar, Margaret, who had been quietly taking notes, agreed to read out a statement from the HOA's rulebook affirming that if a majority of households petitioned for a special election, Karen's position could be suspended pending investigation. At that moment, Mrs. Jenkins stood up once more, holding a list of signatures already gathered, beyond the required threshold, to force a leadership change, a move that clearly shocked Karen into speechlessness. Amid the clamor, the journalist moved through the crowd, capturing testimonies from individuals who were only too eager to share their experiences of paying exorbitant fines, dealing with threats of foreclosure, and seeing no improvements in community facilities. Worried glances. When it came time for witness testimony, Thomas was called first, offering a step-by-step account of his gradual realization that board votes were being manipulated or outright concealed to rubber-stamp Karen's favored contracts. While the defense attempted to cast doubt on Thomas's credibility, suggesting he was disgruntled over personal disagreements with Karen, he calmly referenced official board minutes and email chains that corroborated his claims. Next came Jackson, carrying a binder nearly bursting with spreadsheets, photos, and internal emails, all compiled over his tenure as the HOA's financial auditor, coupled with evidence gleaned from the volunteer-led investigations. He explained how he had meticulously cross-checked each suspicious transaction with the timeline of hedge violations, fabricated complaint forms, and Elite Green Solutions' subsequent emergency services charges. Pausing to collect himself, Jackson also recounted how his hedges had been destroyed without warning, describing the personal sense of violation that fueled his drive to dig deeper into the HOA's finances. Throughout his testimony, the defense attempted to dismiss Jackson as a vindictive homeowner seeking revenge, but each accusation fell flat in the face of meticulously documented inconsistencies and corroborating witness statements. At one particularly telling moment, Jackson handed the judge a scanned invoice where the date of emergency hedge trimming matched the exact day of a so-called board meeting that no minutes recorded, revealing a glaring cover-up. The prosecution hammered this point, emphasizing that no official board decision ever authorized that trimming, lending credence to Jackson's assertion that Karen had personally orchestrated the act in retaliation for his inquiries into rising HOA fees. Gasps rippled through the spectators when a new piece of evidence was introduced. An email from Karen to Elite Green Solutions instructing them to take care of those hedges immediately, no matter what, tying her directly to the incident. Karen's lawyer objected, claiming the email lacked context, but the judge allowed it, noting that it aligned with multiple other documented irregularities pointing to personal vendettas waged through HOA mechanisms. Mrs. Jenkins followed Jackson, albeit briefly, her trembling hands clutching a series of violation letters that demanded over $5,000 in aggregate fines for minuscule issues, all promptly nullified once she paid into accounts tied to Elite Green Solutions. She spoke softly yet resolutely, her voice quavering as she described sleepless nights, terrified that the HOA might foreclose on her house, an emotional testament to the human toll behind the reams of financial data. Meanwhile, the defense tried a new angle, arguing that Karen was merely an overzealous leader struggling to maintain neighborhood standards, and that any financial confusion stemmed from poor record-keeping rather than intentional deceit. In response, the prosecution recounted how the forensic accountants painstakingly traced funds through multiple layers of obfuscation, dismissing any notion of innocent error given the pattern of repeated, deliberate concealment. During cross-examination, the defense questioned the authenticity of some documents, hinting at possible forgeries, only to be met with notarized statements from multiple residents confirming their origins and chain of custody. By midday, the breadth of evidence had grown overwhelming. Even neutral observers could see the prosecution had assembled a compelling tapestry of corruption, all roads leading back to Karen's personal gain. Once the defense rested its case for the preliminary hearing, both sides awaited the judge's decision, tensions high as she sifted through the large binder of exhibits submitted over the course of the morning. In measured tones, the judge commended the thoroughness of the evidence, remarking that she had rarely seen such a well-documented array of alleged HOA abuses, and deemed the case more than sufficient to move forward to trial. A collective sigh of relief escaped from the prosecution's side, while Karen's lawyers exchanged anxious whispers, understanding that their client now faced a full-scale legal battle with charges carrying severe potential penalties. As the hearing adjourned, murmurs filled the courtroom, with neighbors hugging one another and reporters jostling for on-the-spot reactions, capturing the sense that a major milestone had been reached in the quest for justice. Outside, a reporter thrust a microphone toward Jackson, asking how he felt about the judge's decision. He replied simply that truth had to be heard, and today was a step in that direction. Thomas added that the community still had much work ahead, but this preliminary ruling vindicated every person who had suffered under Karen's reign, proving their complaints were not just gripes, but genuine cries for accountability. Karen refused to speak, glaring daggers at the knot of neighbors outside, her silent anger a far cry from the confident, imperious demeanor she once displayed at HOA meetings, as she was swiftly escorted to a waiting car. Returning to Willow Creek Gardens that evening, Jackson found his neighbors gathered in quiet celebration on the street, passing around plates of home-baked treats and raising toasts not to gloat, but to honor their shared resilience. Looking at the half-grown hedges that now offered a glimpse of the privacy he once enjoyed, Jackson realized how far they had all come from that initial shock of betrayal, forging a sense of unity that would outlast any legal battle. He felt a pang of relief, recognizing that while the trial still lay ahead, the preliminary hearing's outcome confirmed what everyone in Willow Creek Gardens already knew, that justice, though slow in coming, was finally within reach. Following the resounding outcome of Karen's preliminary hearing, Willow Creek Gardens entered a new phase of cautious optimism, tempered by the realization that a full criminal or civil trial would be far more intense and drawn out than the brief proceedings they had just witnessed. Determined to maintain the momentum, Thomas worked with the interim board to accelerate reforms designed to protect homeowners from future abuses, finalizing new bylaws requiring transparent bidding processes, open financial reports, and mandatory town hall-style discussions before major community expenditures. Encouraged by the judge's decision, Jackson found himself fielding fresh requests from nearby neighborhoods asking for guidance in auditing their own HOA boards, a testament to how the Willow Creek story had sparked broader change beyond its borders. Though he was heartened to see collective activism blossoming, Jackson also guarded his privacy, recalling how Karen's retribution had left him with butchered hedges and months of stress, a reminder of what unscrupulous leadership could do to someone who dared to speak out. Meanwhile, the prosecution ramped up its investigation in preparation for the main trial, systematically interviewing residents who had experienced HOA harassment under Karen's rule, assembling a chronological paper trail of misconduct that spanned years. The media coverage only intensified, with local and even national outlets fascinated by the idea that a once ordinary homeowner like Jackson, sparked into action by a seemingly minor landscaping dispute, could end up leading a watershed moment in HOA accountability. To manage their growing public profile, Thomas and Jackson agreed to coordinate statements, ensuring they focused on transparency, collective justice, and neighborhood unity rather than inflaming tensions or prematurely celebrating Karen's downfall. Late one evening, Jackson found a typed letter slipped under his door, warning that arrogant vigilantes would face consequences, a chilling echo of earlier threats meant to silence dissent, a stark reminder that Karen or her allies might still be at large. Choosing not to be intimidated, He scanned and forwarded the letter to the district attorney's office and shared its contents with Thomas, who promptly alerted the interim board, underscoring the need for ongoing vigilance and community support. In the wake of these threats, more neighbors volunteered to watch out for each other's homes, organizing a neighborhood watch that worked in tandem with local law enforcement, a far cry from the days when neighbors avoided involvement for fear of reprisals. Within a few weeks, the trial date was set, leaving just enough time for depositions, discovery, and the finalization of the countless documents that would form the backbone of the prosecution's case against Karen. Jackson braced himself for another round of official questioning, fully aware that the defense would likely dig deeper into his personal life, attempting to depict him as a disgruntled troublemaker with a vendetta rather than a concerned resident seeking justice. Thomas, too, steeled himself for cross-examination, reflecting on the moral journey he had undergone, initially complacent, then awakened by Jackson's audit, and finally transformed into a vocal critic of Karen's schemes. In small but meaningful gestures, the community rallied around the two men, offering help with yard chores, cooking meals, or simply stopping by to express gratitude, affirming that no matter what happened in court, their neighbors had their backs. Margaret, once Karen's right-hand figure in the HOA office, fully cooperated with the investigators, providing a trove of internal memos, neglected meeting minutes, and off-the-record notes that shed further light on Karen's methods of co-opting board members. As the evidence mounted, it became increasingly clear that Karen had cultivated a culture of fear and favor trading, ensuring anyone who dared to oppose her either faced steep penalties or found themselves ostracized from community events. Emboldened by the strength of their case, the district attorney's team began drafting charges that surpassed simple fraud, including conspiracy to commit extortion, given the threat of liens and property seizure for those who refused to comply with bogus fines. While some doubted whether all these charges would ultimately stick, the public nature of Karen's alleged crimes brought an outpouring of moral and financial support from legal advocacy groups eager to see a corrupt HOA official face real consequences. Simultaneously, the board in Willow Creek Gardens took steps to replenish the neighborhood's drained reserve fund, cutting extraneous expenses, renegotiating service contracts at fair market rates, and establishing a transparent pipeline for community enhancements. These initiatives soon bore fruit, as residents noticed tangible improvements, freshly painted public areas, better managed landscaping, and a sense that their monthly fees were at last being spent on the very amenities they had been promised for years. Despite the community's progress, a persistent air of tension lingered as the trial date loomed, and the strain was visible in the anxious expressions of neighbors who had never before stepped foot in a courtroom. Some worried Karen might orchestrate a settlement, thus avoiding a public trial and burying vital details about how easily HOA systems could be exploited. But the prosecutors showed no sign of backing down, eager to set a legal precedent. In their final rounds of depositions, Jackson and Thomas were asked about every facet of their involvement: how the financial anomalies were first discovered, the precise sequence of events leading to the confrontation at the emergency HOA meeting, and the evidence chain of custody that proved Karen's direct involvement. Lawyers for the defense tried to sow doubt by raising technicalities about the bylaw interpretations or the legality of certain documents obtained by Jackson, yet each challenge was met with thorough explanations and multiple corroborating witnesses. Outside the legal sphere, the sense of solidarity in Willow Creek Gardens reached a crescendo. Neighbors organized potlucks that felt more like strategy sessions, openly discussing how they'd testify or share evidence if called, forging an unbreakable circle of trust. Even those who had once harbored minor grudges or petty feuds found common ground in their desire to reclaim and protect the integrity of the place they called home, a unifying force more powerful than any internal squabble. As the trial date neared, Jackson noticed something remarkable about his hedges. They had grown tall enough to restore a semblance of his long-lost privacy, yet he chose to trim them at a slightly lower height, not out of fear, but out of symbolic defiance against Karen's arbitrary standards. One afternoon, he caught Mrs. Jenkins standing across the street, smiling in approval at his flourishing shrubs, the unspoken sentiment passing between them. They had both been victims, but no longer prisoners of fear. Word then spread that Karen's lawyers had requested a delay, citing the complexity of the case. But the judge denied this motion, affirming the community's right to timely justice and refusing to let the matter languish in procedural limbo. Thomas publicly praised the judge's decision, reminding reporters that every month of delay inflicted further stress on a neighborhood striving to move on from Karen's destructive legacy, and that fairness dictated a prompt resolution. Media interest peaked once more, with national outlets framing the upcoming trial as a landmark test of whether HOAs could be held accountable for corrupt governance. And reporters from multiple states arrived to cover the proceedings. To prepare for the onslaught, the interim board expanded their media liaison group, ensuring that reporters would have accurate information rather than speculating or sensationalizing rumors. Jackson privately grappled with conflicting emotions. A sincere relief that justice might soon be served, juxtaposed with exhaustion from the unending cycle of depositions, interviews, and public scrutiny since the Hedge incident first began. Nevertheless, each time he gazed at his partially regrown Hedges, he remembered the fury and betrayal he felt on that day of their butchering, and the subsequent awakening that set him on this path toward championing transparency and accountability. Over coffee one morning, he confided in Thomas that if he could rewind time, he wasn't sure he'd choose to avoid the fight, despite all the stress, for it led to a profound transformation in both the neighborhood and his own sense of purpose. Thomas nodded in agreement, asserting that the adversity had forced them all to confront complacency, proving that even in a quiet suburban setting, people had the power to expose wrongdoing and rebuild a shattered community from the ground up. As final trial preparations took shape, Willow Creek Gardens readied itself once again, this time for a deeper, more grueling legal process that might unveil every detail of Karen's twisted network of influence but would, at last, give them closure. In the face of that impending challenge, the neighborhood pulsed with renewed determination, drawing strength from each wave of progress, each new ally, and each symbolic milestone marking their path away from oppression and into a future molded by collective effort. And so, hand in hand, they inched toward the moment of truth, braced for the potential torrent of revelations, yet fortified by the knowledge that if their unity had toppled one HOA tyrant, it could undoubtedly endure the gauntlet of any courtroom drama to come.